So I'm originally from Regina. I went to Luther High School for most of my high school years, not all of them, and then went to the University of Regina for my undergraduate degree. I was enrolled through Luther College from the beginning. And I was kind of one of those students, like I did well in high school. I loved school. I've always been like a real super nerd. I say affectionately towards myself. But when I started university, I really had little to no clear idea about what I wanted to do, even within university and then after that in terms of career. So when I started university, like I said, I was really into academics, and I kind of had an idea that, oh, maybe I want to have an academic career, be a professor. So the path that I sort of roughly had in mind going into university was to do my undergrad and then a master's and a PhD and sort of stay within that institution. But at that point, I wasn't really clear on what I wanted. So I was even kind of contemplating, oh, maybe I want to do medicine. I really don't know. So I ended up taking a variety of courses in my first year, and that was what was suggested to me, to take a mix of both arts and science courses. Very clearly, didn't really enjoy the science classes. They were great, but I was done with them after the first year bio and chem classes, and I really liked my arts courses. So I decided pretty early on that I wanted to be an art student and major in that. I wasn't in a pre-professional program and didn't have a pre-professional designation in my undergraduate degree. I ended up majoring in religious studies, which I took purely because I thought it was super interesting. It was, it's a program I recommend taking an elective if you haven't, but it's just an interesting area of study that focuses on humans and human communities and that sort of thing, and is very interdisciplinary in nature. So it allowed me to kind of explore a lot of my interests within the humanities inside of that program, and also had really just fantastic professors that were great mentors for me in that way. So I did my religious studies degree. I did an honors degree in that. And towards the end of that degree, like going into my fourth year, was when I was sort of thinking about what the next step was. So at that point, kind of early on in my fourth year, I applied to both law schools and grad schools. And I'll talk a little bit more later on kind of what led me to applying to law school. But applied for both. I did my LSAT in the fall of my fourth year. I signed up for the LSAT on the very last day I could. I didn't study enough. It was very stressful. Don't do it that way. If you are going down that route, give yourself enough time and it will be a much more pleasant experience for you than it was for me. But yeah, completed the LSAT. I was very successful in my undergraduate degree. I had a really high GPA, and as a result of those two things, I ended up having offers for both law school and grad school in my fourth year. Again, story of my life, like had no idea what I was doing, even what city I wanted to be in, what school I wanted to be in. So I applied like across Canada for both law school and grad school, and had a lot of options that way. But again, I was sort of in this position where I had a lot of like a lack of clarity at that point in my life about what I wanted to do, and kind of whether I even wanted to go to law school, whether I really wanted to go to grad school. So to be honest, it was actually quite a difficult time in my life. And, if you're having difficulties that way, like you're pretty normal. I think we often underestimate how difficult those like early years outside of high school are. So yeah, kind of in my fourth year, I frankly was like experiencing a lot of burnout from my academic programs. I also had a significant injury at the time. And so, I was feeling a little tired of university, to be honest. And I think in hindsight, did know in my fourth year that I didn't want to go down that academic path, but hadn't kind of admitted that to myself at that point. In my fourth year of university, and also my third year to a certain extent, I was also like exploring a lot of interests outside of religious studies. which ended up being really crucial for me. Like I was taking classes outside of my major. I was taking a lot of women and gender studies courses. I was doing a lot of volunteer work, both within the university and outside of the university. Um, I was doing some jobs like out that had nothing to do with my academic program. I was a summer student at Kids Help Phone for a couple of years. And at that time, like experiencing all of that, it became increasingly clear to me that I wanted to have a job that was a community service oriented career. And that I wanted a job that took me outside of the institution of the university and had me out working in the community, doing like ideally social justice oriented work. So it ultimately ended up happening in my fourth year. Like I sort of was in this angsty period, difficult time in my life. And I ended up deferring everything for a year. And that was for a lot of reasons. Part of it was like this lack of clarity about what I wanted to do, but it was also the health side of things, and just feeling like I needed to step back and reflect on what was right for me. So I spent a year working a variety of jobs. I was an assistant in the Luther Library, which was awesome, and a research assistant with a prof at Luther who's now retired. I was a dance teacher, and I was a legal assistant and an intake worker for a nonprofit called Pro Bono Law Saskatchewan in Regina, that they provide free legal services to low-income folks here. So that was a great year for me. It was a difficult year again because it was like a big year of change and like reflection and figuring out what I wanted to do. But it gave me a lot of perspective on like what my priorities were in my life, in my career, and in my education. And I think made it clear to me that like there were other possibilities for me and that I'd be happy doing things that I didn't necessarily think I would be happy doing. So I decided in the summer, going into the next academic year, that I was going to go to law school. And I decided to go to law school at the U of S. I picked University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. I picked the U of S for a number of reasons. It's a small school. It's one of the smallest law schools in Canada. I liked that it kind of had a local perspective. Like law in Canada is both federal and provincial. And I thought it made a lot of sense. I knew that I wanted to practice in Saskatchewan, so I thought it made sense to be going to school in Saskatchewan, learning Saskatchewan law, building those connections and networks in this province. And I was also really attracted to the U of S has a really interesting clinical law program. So you can actually get course credit working full time for a semester in like a community legal assistance clinic. So that was a really unique opportunity with that school, and chose to go there. Again, I said before, story of my life. I had a lot of uncertainty going into law school about whether it was the right next step for me. I worried whether I would like it, whether I would fit in, whether I'd like the other students. But I kind of went into it like in my head thinking like, this is a 1-year commitment, I'll do it. And if I don't like it, I can change directions. And if I do like it, I'll keep going. And as you can tell, I stayed on. And law school was a great few years for me. It was a really transformative time in my life. I found law school to be really interesting academically. You get to take classes learning about this system of rules that like supports a lot of the functioning that happens in our society, and it was really interesting. Met a lot of really interesting people. Being at a small school, I had a lot of opportunities that I think I wouldn't have had at a larger institution. Getting to do like volunteer work, being research assistants, developing like really close mentor relationships with professors and really close relationships with other students. And it set me up really well. And I'm a big proponent of attending smaller institutions for that reason. I think that in my experience, the level of education is equivalent or better to larger institutions. And I think you get a lot more opportunities and sort of silly, but you're like, the big fish in a small pond. And I really believe that I wouldn't have had all the opportunities that I've had since then had I gone to a larger institution. Yeah, so that was law school. During law school, I worked as a summer student at a law firm. As I said, did a lot of volunteer work, stuff like that. And then following law school, imagine not all of you are familiar about like the path to become qualified as a lawyer, but you have to do a year of articling, which is kind of like an apprenticeship. And then you also do some additional coursework during that year. It depends on which province you're in terms of what the specific requirements are. But I spent my articling year working at the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. So in that role, I was assigned to 2 judges at the Court of Appeal, and basically my role was to support their work. So I did a lot of research in that role, analysis of legal issues. It was a lot of like reading and writing, writing up briefs and memos, kind of analyzing different issues in a particular case. I would attend court hearings. I would talk with my judges before and after hearing about the issues in a case. And yeah, it was, again, a fantastic experience. It gave me a lot of insight into the inner workings of our court system in the province. And then again, came to that place of like, okay, what's the next step after this? So I always still had in the back of my mind this academic interest. And I think even going into law school, I thought that I probably wanted to do a graduate degree following law school. So I decided after my articling year that that was a good time to do that. So I did a master's degree, again, applied all over the place in multiple countries and just not knowing kind of where I'd get accepted and where I'd want to end up going. But I got accepted to the University of Cambridge in England, among a few other places. I ended up getting a full scholarship to go to Cambridge, actually, which made the decision for me. It was an easy one. And yeah, that was an amazing experience to go study law, study anything in an international setting with people from all over the world, Europe, North America, South America, Africa, Australia. So yeah, that was a really great year. And then the next step. So I moved back to Saskatchewan. My partner and I, we were both over in England doing our master's degrees. He's a lawyer as well. So we knew that we wanted to come back to Saskatchewan. This is our home, and we both feel very committed to the community here and committed to kind of like using our talents and our privileges to work within this community and our families here and so forth. So so we knew we wanted to come back to Saskatchewan. When I moved back, I didn't have a job lined up. Again, it was a difficult period to figure out, like, okay, I've done like all these cool things and done my master's, and like, what next? And like, what use is this going to be to me? And yeah, so again, applied all over the place, spent a lot of time, talking to various mentors and people I knew to get their insights into that. And a position opened up with public prosecutions in Regina. And I applied and got there. I was hired there in November of 2019 and have been there ever since. So I've been working as a prosecutor for about a year and a half now. So I thought I'd share like a bit about what my current job looks like. In law school, I didn't know what it really meant to be a lawyer. And being a lawyer can look really, really different depending on where you're working. So I'm a government employee. I'm an employee of the government of Saskatchewan, which is pretty sweet. You get benefits and nice vacation days and things like that. But in terms of what my job actually looks like, so I practice criminal law exclusively. And criminal law, I think like the best way to describe it is it's divided between docket work and trial work. So docket court is basically like you get arrested and charged with something, and then you get a court date and you have to show up for that court date. And at docket court, a lot of what we are doing is like trying to see if we can resolve charges. So without a trial. So it basically involves like seeing if people are willing to plead guilty to certain charges. A lot of the work of a docket prosecutor is like you'll get a stack of like 70 files that are up in court the next day, and your job is to like review all those files, and you assess like whether we have enough evidence to prove this offense, and you determine whether it's also in the public interest to pursue this prosecution. Our focus at that stage is trying to, like I said, resolve charges. So you're negotiating with defense counsel around like, okay, what's this person going to plead guilty to? What charges are we maybe willing to drop because we don't have enough evidence, or in exchange for that guilty plea? And then trying to reach agreements around like the type of sentence that you're going to propose to the court to impose on that person. So it looks like a lot of negotiation, pretty much, a lot of time emailing other lawyers, being on the phone with other lawyers, that type of thing. And then a lot of time in court. So like today, for instance, I'm handling, our office works at a number of rural circuit points in Saskatchewan. So I'm currently the prosecutor who is handling the court points in Carlisle and Weyburn. Court's happening by phone right now with COVID, so it's very strange, but like I spent all morning just like on the phone in court dealing with all these files that were coming up, doing some sentencings, things like that. So that's kind of the one side of criminal law. Then the other side of criminal law is, of course, running trials. Trials are a lot like what you see on TV, except much slower, more chaotic, and less exciting, and like less pretty. But it's basically that. So trials happen when we can't resolve things at docket stage, and sometimes that's the case. People will insist that they're not guilty, or they think that there's a big evidentiary issue that the prosecutions are going to have trouble proving their case. So I'm going to run a trial on that and see if they succeed or not. So yeah, that's kind of the other side of it, is the trial side of it. So that involves, like you'd see on TV, calling witnesses to testify in court and cross-examining people and things like that, making arguments to the court. So yeah, like I said, right now my job is kind of a combination of the two things. I'm handling all the matters that are out in Weyburn and Carlisle, whether they're trial matters or docket matters. So that's kind of what a day in the life looks like for me. It's a lot of reading papers and having phone calls and things like that. But a few kind of like interesting things about my job, or like things I like about my job, I'll kind of run through that. The first thing I really like about my job is that I really believe it's like public service work. And I really like that aspect of my work. Like I pick up a file, and it doesn't matter like where this person is from, how much money they have, anything like that. Like my task is to take this file and do a good job of handling it, fulfill my obligations in my role. And I really like that. In my job, as many of you are probably aware of, criminal law tends to be highly concentrated among marginalized community members in our city, in our province, in our country, and I think in most countries. So a lot of the people that I'm dealing with, either as accused persons or as victims of crime, are people who are extremely vulnerable, very marginalized, and people who are at very difficult times in their lives, and people who often lead very, very difficult lives. And I enjoy that part of my work. I find it meaningful, and I think as a prosecutor, you can, really represent the criminal justice system in a way that minimizes the harm that it causes, and, even by just being respectful to people and understanding their circumstances. So I like that aspect of it. My job is also just super interesting. Like it's fundamentally about human stories and human behavior, and you pick up a file and it's always interesting. I've literally never had a boring day at my job, and that's pretty awesome. Sometimes I wish I did have a boring day because it's pretty chaotic and a really heavy workload, but but it's good. I also enjoy that I have a lot of responsibility in my job, and like very early on in my career, and almost to like an alarming level. um, but prosecutors have a lot of discretion around how we do our jobs. Like you're the one who in many ways decides how things resolve. Like you can decide somebody comes into custody on a charge, you decide, are we going to consent to them getting out on bail? Or are we going to, have a hearing that the judge has to decide, and that, has a lot of responsibility. And that's meaningful too. It's stressful, but it's meaningful work in that way. Like I said, I also find that we have an important role in representing the justice system to the broader public, whether it's an accused person, whether it's a victim, the general public. And I think that there's a high level of responsibility to try to do that work in a respectful way, and to try to make that process a little bit easier for people than it might otherwise be, and ensure that they feel like heard and seen and understood in that process. I also find that the work is extremely challenging, and that's obviously really difficult some days and some weeks. And, sometimes it's easier to handle than others, but it's, you're dealing with very, very complicated situations, really difficult decision-making in the job. We have a really heavy caseload and somewhat limited resources. So that's always difficult to manage the workload. And it's also challenging in the way that, we're working in an imperfect justice system and also an imperfect world. So, for instance, you'll be handling like a lot of domestic violence cases, which is a really common thing in our community. And you kind of wish that you could fix this problem. And the criminal justice system only has like one, I think, small role to play in that. And that can be challenging. And it can also be difficult in that we are exposed to like some pretty disturbing material sometimes. But yeah, it's not as glamorous as TV makes it look. It's like, picture me driving out to Carlisle at 7 a.m. with my pockets full of highlighters and sticky notes and a big book beside me. But yeah, it's good. And the other thing that I really like about my job is that it is a job where there's just constant learning. And I think that's true for me. Like I'm in the early stages of my career, so there is so much learning, but it continues even later on in your career. So that's kind of like my path, what my current job looks like and my perspective on it. So I'll just move to, I have kind of just a few reflections to share with you, and take it or leave it. Some of it's advice that may or may not be useful for you, and then we can move to questions. So yeah, I guess the first thing that, like, thinking about this and doing this presentation here was really interesting to me. I really clearly remember standing in your shoes, wherever that is, whether you're 18 years old and you're in high school, or you're in second year university, third year university, and like being at the beginning of this process. And I keep thinking, like, had I told myself at age 18, like, this is where you'll be. I'm 30 years old today, actually, it's my birthday. So this is where you'll be in 12 years. Being a prosecutor, working in Regina, and this is what your job will look like as a prosecutor, and these are all the things you would have done. Like, I don't even want to say that I couldn't picture it, or I wouldn't believe that that was where I'd end up, but like it's beyond what I think I could have even conceptualized at that time in my life. And I find that really interesting, because I did feel like in those days that I was really sort of adrift in a lot of ways. And now looking back, I can just see the path so clearly, and how it makes a lot of sense in hindsight. So I think, like, maybe the takeaway from that is, like, give yourself a bit of trust that you will, like, find your way. If you're somebody like me who was a lot of tears shed at that time in my life. And kind of related to that, like, another kind of reflection that I've had is the importance of being open to opportunities, and being open to your interests changing, and being open to changing the path that you're on. I never thought that I would be a lawyer, and I didn't start thinking about being a lawyer until I started doing some stuff that was outside of my major and my academic program. I was doing a lot of volunteer work, and I was taking a lot of women and gender studies classes, like I mentioned earlier. And in particular, I just like happened to take a women and gender studies class that in one of our readings, we were learning about an organization out in Vancouver that was a legal organization called Pivot. It's a really cool organization, and they were doing a lot of advocacy work for marginalized women and marginalized Indigenous women in Vancouver. And I remember reading about that organization and just thinking like, I can see myself doing that, and feeling like as much as you can kind of describe a bit of a calling that way. And it was just, really by chance that ended up happening. So I would encourage you to like explore those other interests. Like if you have electives, use them as an opportunity to kind of broaden your experience. And I think you never know kind of where that will take you. And that's been a really valuable thing for me. I think that I would say the same thing about like my decision to take a year off from school. Again, that was something like if you had told like 18-year-old me that, I would be like, no way, like that's not even like, I wouldn't even consider that as, that's not for me. And like again, it was just the absolute right decision for me. And it was the decision that kind of gave me that clarity for what I wanted to do next. And yeah, again, like even within law school, like I never thought I would be a prosecutor. Now I am, and I love my job and it's great. So I would encourage you to be open. I was asked to comment on the LSAT specifically. This should be its own session for people who are considering law. But all I would say on that is don't do what I did. Start studying early and use the official materials from LSAT. I didn't initially, and it kind of screwed me over a bit. So use the official materials. There are lots of courses you can take. You can hire private tutors, things like that, if it's something that you're struggling on. But just start that process early. Another big takeaway for me, and this applies to anyone in any walk of life, but particularly people who are in any sort of pre-professional program, is it's very important in my experience to take care of yourself and to take care of all parts of your life, even outside of academics. I frankly totally burned myself out through high school and my undergrad. Wasn't looking after myself, and it forced me to take time off to really reset that way. And since then, like I still work hard, I still pull long hours, but nowhere near as obsessively. And that's been a really beneficial thing in my life. And I think like it's important for anyone to have balance in their life, and balance between like working really hard in school or your job while still prioritizing relationships and prioritizing your well-being and health. But this is particularly so for people who are pursuing professional careers. These are really demanding and really stressful academic programs and careers. Like it doesn't get easier when you're out of school. It gets harder when you're out of school. And it's really important to build a life for yourself that is going to support that difficult work. And it's good work and it's meaningful work. But if you don't kind of have those supports and resources outside of your job, it can put you in a bad space. And then like relatedly, obviously it's really important to work hard, get your grades up and things like that, because that's going to give you a lot of opportunities. But keep things in perspective. And like, this is not advice that I would have been in any position to hear or accept 12 years ago, but perfectionism can be a really harmful way of approaching your life. And so as much as you can, like, keep that in check. The example I give actually is, I mentioned earlier that my partner is a lawyer as well. He's basically in a totally equivalent job to me, working for the Ministry of Justice with constitutional law. He did high school, had an average that was probably like 10, 15% below my perfectionistic one, had a great time, did his undergrad, did journalism, again, worked hard, but not obsessively. We went to law school together. I probably worked 30% like more than him. He clerked at a court as well. He did a master's in England as well. And we have basically the same job. So if you want proof that like, you don't need to go to that total standard of perfection to have like an awesome pathway for yourself and opportunities, that's what I'd give you. So there's a lesson in there somewhere to reflect on. Um, and just two more points here. The next one is, and it's kind of related, but enjoy the process of your undergrad and enjoy the process of your professional program in the early days in your career. But particularly in your undergrad, the benefit of pursuing a professional program is that your undergrad is not your only degree. You're going to be in university for a while, sometimes a really long while. And some programs do have prerequisites. So obviously you need to kind of deal with those. But otherwise, it really is a step to the next program for you. And so I think that gives you like a great opportunity to take courses that you're interested in, to pick a major that you're interested in, and like, take things purely out of interest or because that's a great professor, or, you've never taken a course on X. And that can, again, like, open up pathways that you didn't see. And that was my experience for sure. Particularly for law, people have all different backgrounds in law school and in the profession. Like I had classmates who had backgrounds in music, fine arts, political science, literature, business. I had a classmate who was probably the smartest person I went to school with, who owned a comic book store in Toronto for like 8 years before he went to law school. So don't feel like you need to, fully prep yourself for only ever doing law. Many people also worked for quite a few years before going back to school. Yeah, and I mean, kind of related to that is also like, don't feel like you have to rush this process too much. Finish your degree. If like professional programs are really expensive, it might be a good decision to work for a few years. So reflect on that about kind of what the right path is for you. And then, my last point that I'll just end on is, in my experience, and this is also a lot easier to do in a small program if you're going through Luther College or another college or that type of thing, is that I have found it very beneficial to seek out mentorship and cultivate relationships in my program. I've found that to be really crucial to my success and have relied on my mentors to help me in my decision-making process and support me at various stages of both school and work. So that's the final thing I would leave with you. But that's all I had to say.